Thanks, Robin. This is a big event for me on a number of reasons tonight. The first is, this is the first time I can come out in that debutante kind of way as an academic rather than an administrator at UWA. And so because of that, I prepared by wearing a good outfit, which is I went into my closet and got a Harris tweed, and I went into my drawer and got a pipe. Just so anyone who thinks I'm an administrator, I've got the right outfit on and a good prop to bring with me. The second reason I'm excited to be here today is this is actually the unofficial launch of a book that I got on Wednesday last week. I think there's only 3 copies in Australia, and believe it or not, I'll end the presentation saying buy one. And I've got 35% discount vouchers in case that won't tempt anyone else. A number of introductory remarks. We do meet on Wajak Buja, and it's really, I personally want to extend my respect to elders past and present. The Nungalei group has looked after this land, particularly this spot where you'll know when Captain Sterling came up the river was the first place where he came to, and he was welcomed by the Wajak, and we still sit with that permission and respect. So my respect to elders past and present of the Nunga. Also, thank you to the Institute of Advanced Studies and particularly Susan for having me here today to prove that I am not just an administrator, but I can do a few other things. We're going to talk about Japan in a moment, but what does Japan have to do with anything in Australia? I'll be closing with the argument that when we look at other countries, in this case Japan, it can teach us something about our process here in Australia, and particularly our political process and our delivery of justice process. That's the overall argument, but hang out, it's a short course. I'll get to that one at the end. But my first message begins with the book. And the book's got a snazzy title, because if you don't have a snazzy title, you don't sell many copies. And the title is Who Rules Japan? And this comes out of a debate in the academic literature of the 1980s and the 1990s saying who has the political clout in Japan to decide the direction of the country. And there was a fellow named Chalmers Johnson at the University of California who argued in Japan it was the bureaucracy, and they dominated the conversation. And then subsequently a number of scholars said together, actually no, there's kind of this conspiracy cabal going on. And it's the bureaucracy, the elite bureaucracy, aligned with the elite politicians, aligned with the elite business people. And they all kind of get together and they figure it out. And then a very interesting Dutch guy came into the debate and he says, no, you're all wrong. It's a headless chicken. And the headless chicken goes back to that old quote you've heard many times. If you have the option of being a conspiracy or just a stuff up, normally it's a stuff up. And basically what he was arguing is there is no one who's managing this. Rather what you have is a very homogeneous society where the people who have come through are quite similar, and so they have quite similar ways of thinking. So even though there's not coordination, it can look like there's coordination. So that's a debate that's going on in the 80s and 90s, but it has real impact. It has real impact between 1996 and 2005, that decade right there. Because what happened in Japan was, you'll all know, the economy had this peak in about up to 1991, and then it stagnated. And that stagnation allowed for a massive amount of law reform to happen in the decade between 96 and 2005. And like good reformers, they say, well, we're trying to fix the economy, but let's fix some other things while we're doing this. And one of the other things they wanted to fix was this notion that the regular people were in none of those stories about who was ruling Japan. The regular, part of democracy, of the messiness of the population, were not part of the headless chicken. They were not part of the conspiracy cabal, and they weren't part of the bureaucracy. So as the reforms are going through, there's a whole series of new reforms that come in that are putting regular people, lay people, into different bits. And that's what the book is talking about. The bit that I've spent probably over a decade working on is in 2004, Japan introduces a jury system, or what I call a quasi-jury system. In Japanese, saibain seido. And it's a quasi-jury system because I'll go through a description of it, and parts of it you'll say, yeah, that sounds like a jury. But parts of it you'll say, well, that doesn't sound like the jury I know. And that, just to signal that, is putting the quasi in front of it. So the law was passed in 2004, but it was felt it was such a radical change that they needed 5 years to get the entire court system and population ready. So that then meant it was actually launched in August of 2009. The cool thing about August 2009, that means we've got almost exactly 5 years of data since it's been enacted, which now lets us go back and look to see whether or not this has been a successful experiment or not. And that's what I'm interested in. But quickly on what the lay judge system or the Sadain Seido looks like. The first is it's only for criminal cases, but only the harshest of the harsh criminal cases. So in this case, a case where the penalty, the highest penalty is death, life imprisonment, or it was an intentional crime where someone died. And that picks up arson where someone's in the house. Okay? So it's a limited amount of cases, about somewhere between 3% and 2.5% of all criminal cases in Japan. Important thing though is it was not optional. If you do one of those crimes, you don't have an option of opting out of the jury like we have. Second thing is, well, who are these jurors? Who are the lay people that are involved? Well, they do it exactly the same way we do it in Australia. They go to the voters' polls, they send it out randomly, and people are brought in. That's quite different than the European mixed court system. The third one is, well, what does it look like? You remember the Anglo-American Australian system has 1 judge and 12 jurors, 12 angry men. What does it look like in Japan? It's quite different. It looks more like a European mixed court. It has 6 lay people and 3 professional judges hearing the case together. Okay? So quite different. Indeed, they're hearing the case together, which means they're deciding both judgment, guilty, not guilty, but they're also deciding sentencing. Put them in jail for a year, don't put them in jail, all those different options. That's radically different from the Anglo system that we have in Australia. Next interesting bit is, well, how's the deliberation? You might remember from the great movie 12 Angry Men that it has to be unanimous consent in our system. All 12 have to be aligned. Not in this Japan mixed system. It's a majority. But the majority says you have to have at least 1 layperson and at least 1 judge on that majority. So it can't be dominated by one side or the other. And then the last point there, the ambiguity there. The ambiguity is talking about we don't know actually what happens in the jurors' room or in the deliberation room. So we know they have to come to a majority, but none of that is divulged. And that actually runs into the last one, which is if it is divulged, the penalty is up to 3.5 years in jail. So I, as a researcher, if I go and ask, I'm liable for that. And if someone tells me information, they're liable for that. And that sounds very harsh, but also remember, I actually think Australian rules on jury privacy are probably even stricter than in Japan. But that's basically what the system looks like. So for the early part of this, I spent a number of years saying, well, if we're going to do this, how are we going to know if it works? How are we going to know if it succeeds? And so over a series of articles, came up with 2 different standards to judge the system by. And the first standard was set up looking at the theory of lay participation. And if you look at the theory of lay participation, why would you do it? Because it's really pretty expensive. And it's kind of annoying getting that juror slip. So why would you go through the effort of doing that? And basically, the theory behind this is there's 2 reasons. One, you do it because you're hoping for a better justice. And the argument is judges become narrow and biased, either elite bias or biased by hearing so many cases. The second reason you would do this is because you're actually trying to promote participation democracy. And there's some really interesting research with a friend of mine, a co-writer of mine, who's in the University of Washington, John Gasso, who's looked at American juries and says, if you're on a jury, it's more likely you'll vote later on in an election, so they don't have compulsory elections. So the political participation goes up if you're on juries. So those are the kind of theoretical reasons why you'll do it. But Japan is interesting because it's had lay participation in the past. And if it's had it, well, why are we introducing something new? In other words, what didn't work? So from a historical analysis, you can identify two standards. And Japan had a jury between 1923 and 1943, and Japan had a grand jury from 1946 until today. And one of the things you can see is if you allow the professional judges or the professional lawyers, they can capture the system. And that's what's happened in the grand jury in Japan, or the grand jury. And there's a second problem, which is marginalization. If it becomes such an extreme exception, then it will have no impact. And that happened in the jury system, where over the last 5 years of the jury system, there were only 3 jury trials for all of Japan. So these are the standard by which now that we've got 5 years worth of data, we can go back and say, did it work or not? And so that's what my current research is on. And we're looking at the first 5 years. So I'm going to flip them, but remember the first question we said, was it captured or was it marginalized? So you need a little bit of information here, but the result is in the first 5 years there were 7,754 cases. And of those, there were 44 not guilty, which means a 99.5% conviction rate. Well, that sounds pretty amazing, and it is, but remember Japan begins with a 99.6% conviction rate. So it's a modest change, but probably statistically not different. So we haven't had, so there's an argument we might have had capture by the professional judges in the jury room. Second one is marginalization. And marginalization, again, because it's compulsory, you can't opt out, so we're not going to fall into that problem again, but we do have the cases are only brought if a prosecutor brings them. And if you look at the trend from 2004 to 2014, you can see it's over halved the number of cases that would be caught. So there's an argument that the prosecutors are pushing less cases down there, so it has a possibility of being marginalized. The counter to that argument is this trend predates the introduction of this, and it's gone from 3.5% to 2.5% on a constant line. It doesn't break where you have the introduction. Well, let's go back to the other standard, better justice. Is it delivering better justice? Debatable question what you mean by that, but again, we have a 99.5% conviction rate. That was based, or 0.6 beforehand, that was based on a 92% confession rate. So in Japan, in 92% of the criminal cases, someone said, yep, I did it. In the new system, we've got roughly around 55% confession rate. So we've had a marked change, a major change that's gone on there. The second better justice thing, sentencing more or less has stayed the same, except for one exception, sexual cases, sexual assault, rape, anything with a sex offense, and they come in with harsher penalties. And then the third change, again, is a knock-on change, but we've had a number of things around the edges that have changed. Before the change, there was almost no bail given in Japan, and now bail is regularly given. Before, the prosecutors wouldn't turn over evidence. Now they are turning over evidence, and similarly, the pretrial process has sped up. The last one, well, more democracy. There's an argument that, well, if you've got 99.5% conviction, you're not really having more democracy because the judges are just taking control. But that's actually not what the data shows. The data shows that there have been 220,000 people called, 60,000 people have been served, and we've got good data on that. Of that 60,000 who've served, 95% have said, I was not overly influenced by the professional judges, and I walked out with a positive experience. 82% of people walked in with a caution, 95 walked out having a positive experience. That is an amazing shift in there. So I would definitely say from the more democracy, we've had quite a bit of success. And that's where I'll end. But just going back to the original question, does that have anything to say for Japan? Well, I hope or for Australia. Well, I hope we don't go to 99.5% conviction rates, but I do think it tells us lots of things that we can do around the democracy trends. And remember, this is where Chief Justice Spiegelman in New South Wales a few years ago argued that we should get rid of juries. This suggests that juries actually do have an important place in and can have a very beneficial place in a robust democracy. Thank you very much.